Well, we decided to do the freight rail a little bit differently this year. Uh, in the past, we've had presentations from the Class 1 separate from the short lines, but this year we thought maybe we all ought to get together and recognize that we are a team. Railroading is a team sport, and we all have to work together. So the way I've put this together, I've asked Paul Treangen, who runs the Texas Northwestern Railroad. I first met him some years ago when he was running the Cedar Rapids in Iowa City, which was back in the Cedar Rapids area. And he's going to talk about what the short lines and regionals do and how they help the Class 1s. And then we're asking Lindsay and Clint to comment on, from their perspective, the interface with the short lines and the regionals and how we can all work together to make rail more customer friendly and to build the business. So Paul, why don't you step up and take care of the introduction?
Great. Well, thank you, Karl. Well, let me just begin by talking about what a short line is. And a short line is a Class 3 railroad, as recognized by the Surface Transportation Board. We're a common carrier. The railroads are classed by, your Class 1s would be UP, BNSF, your regionals would be larger than us, of course, and then the short lines, I believe the cutoff is like $36 million for revenue to be a short line. The short lines are small. We're hometown businesses directly tied to the local economies. We connect with our communities. Our people live directly in our communities. We provide local jobs and tax base, and domestic and international shipments move through and on us. We serve inside of plants, ports. We're kind of all over the place. And, I've often said that for small communities, having a short line railroad in your community is kind of like a large community having an NFL franchise. It makes that big of a difference in terms of the economic impact. So it's really important from that perspective. In Texas, as Karl mentioned, I'm the president of the Short Line Association here in Texas, and our association represents 41 short line railroads. That's about 20% of the rail network in the state of Texas. We employ about 1,500 people. We move somewhere around 360,000 carloads annually. So if you put that into perspective, that's like 1,260,000 trucks that are taken off of the rural roads and the highways here. It's very significant. And most of the short lines sprung to life from lines that were abandoned or spun off by the Class 1s back in the 1980s after deregulation occurred. And so these lines were going to be shut down, and so you saw communities and individual investors and people come in and try to keep them alive because they knew they needed rail to bring economic development and even keep the businesses in their communities that they already had. And so the lines were very low density for traffic. The maintenance had been deferred on them for years, so they were in terrible shape. And so these were really entrepreneurs that came in and put millions of dollars of investment into the tracks to bring them back, and then figure out how to work with the communities to drive economic development and bring business back there and keep what was already in town. And so I think if you look at it from that perspective, our businesses are privately funded. We are very safety focused. We're customer focused, and service is where we have to be very effective. And so how are we different from a Class 1? Well, basically our purpose is different even. We're kind of the first and the last mile of moves. And we interface with our shippers very regularly on a personal basis because our people are right there in town, and our employees are right there. And our economics are very different as well. We're small businesses. We only move the car a short distance, so we get a very small portion of the rate. And we typically operate older locomotives. We have to be cost efficient. We have small, dedicated staff of employees, and we hire and train most of our own people, bring them up and teach them the business, and it's a complicated process, takes a long time to be effective. And our services are very labor intensive. We have a tendency to do the things like the industrial switching, building the trains, getting them ready to go, while the Class 1s really specialize in moving the cars from point A to point B, and they focus on the velocity of that move. So we try to do what we can to interface to make that go smoothly. And as I mentioned, to survive, we must be customer and service centric. At T&W and our companies, we own 3 small railroads, so they're about 15 to 20 miles long each. So for us to be effective, we have to market our lines wide. We look to bring people who are not on the railroad in to use our services through other types of things, take the complexity out of it, and we bring rail cars in, we transload them to trucks, we deliver out, and it's a one bill kind of thing to bring more people onto the railroad because every single car counts. We need every car we can get our hands on, and bringing new customers online and providing new services for a broader audience is just really critical. And so how do we work with the Class 1s? Well, we strive to be their partners. A seamless network is really important. Our customers don't care about the differences. They just want to see things move, see it done effectively. And so we want our customers to see it that way. And we develop joint service and interchange plans with our Class 1 partners. We are typically part of their transportation contracts. They pay us a rate per car. In most cases, they help us by providing cars and equipment for loading, and they often use our services for storage, train building, air tests, economic development support, and to be honest, we just need each other. The traffic we generate does not move without our Class 1 partners, and without us, they lose significant traffic. And so Class 1 railroads have made incredible capital investments into their systems. And we average about 25 to 35% of our revenues goes back into the track just for the basic track maintenance and bridge work and things. And so with the heavier equipment that's moving today and those types of things, the service patterns, it's a problem for difficult for short lines to keep up with how the Class 1s are moving from an investment front. And that leads me to the next topic, which is really what do we need in Texas? Because railroads are very capital intensive. And once done, the improvements last for a long time. But for small branches and small companies that struggle to make ends meet, it's difficult to make those types of improvements that can't generate return on investments. And so most states are very engaged and since the 1980s, they have helped short lines meet modern and heavier car requirements and standards and relieve the pressure on their highway networks, but Texas does not. There's never been a process to move funds through to the short lines or support those types of activities, despite the fact that they've done many studies that show the return would be very significant. So key kind of projects would be track and bridge upgrades and to handle safely 286,000-pound cars, interchange tracks to create capacity that allows our Class 1 partners to come in and pull and keep things moving and increase the velocity. We have to be able to provide the necessary infrastructure so that we're not a drag on the process. And so I think it's really important. You heard the FRA just saying, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity here with the type of funding that's going to be available. And frankly, with railroads on the freight side, Texas is going to miss out. We have to have a way to move funds through and help the short lines. So that is a very big, important thing that we need to work on. And I think that's the main thing I'd like to present this morning, and I'll turn it over to next.
Lindsay, why don't you speak?
Welcome. Good morning, everyone. You know, echoing everything Paul said, I certainly cannot speak to, I handle public affairs and government affairs for BNSF. I can't speak to the inner workings nearly as eloquently as you, Paul. But I can say from the BNSF perspective, we have a dedicated short line group whose job is solely to communicate and, collaborate with the short line railroad. So we're very committed to the relationship that Paul articulated. I think another important, sort of more from my perspective, way that we all partner is in our public affairs and lobbying efforts in Austin and really at the federal level as well. So what you see here today is the sort of the people who make up the executive committee of the Texas Railroad Association. And so our partnership with short lines and with each other, I mean, this is the one time you're going to see us not competitors, right? I mean, we agree on things 99% of the time and push in the same direction. And so I think that's a really important point to leave everybody with is, well, we may compete in business, but when it comes down to policy and funding and all of the things that we do in Austin, this is a team that works very, very closely, communicates frequently, and has each other's back.
That's exactly right. And just echoing what Paul mentioned, short lines are clear extensions of the Class 1 network. We are able to market ourselves and our services better with a strong short line system. I also think about agility and think about needing to add more customers as Texas grows. Short lines can be a little more agile. When you think about putting a new customer, citing a new customer on a Class 1, it can be similar to trying to put a gas station on I-35 and needing a new on-ramp and off-ramp. Citing on a short line is, I don't want to say not complicated, but it can be a little easier than working with the Class 1s. And we know that, and we work closely with our short line partners. We connect to 37 short lines here in Texas. To be able to manage that, we've got a short line manager in Omaha who has a direct connection. We hold a short line conference every year where we invite all the short lines to Omaha, all the ports to Omaha where we're headquartered. And we spend a little bit of time talking about business development, making sure that our short lines are connected with our marketing teams. So if they're out working with new customers, they can communicate that back with us and we can join hands and market together. So that is critical for us. And then I'd say the third thing we really do from a short line perspective is we want to hear the voice of the collective short line system across our 23 states. We've got a short line advisory group, has 10 different members that kind of roll on and roll off on a regular cadence, and they give us feedback. That's less so about building new business. It's about short lines telling us what's important to them so that we don't lose sight of that first mile, last mile connection.
I'd like to pick up on something that Paul mentioned. There was approved by the voters of Texas in 2005, became effective in 2006, the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Fund of the state of Texas. It authorized by the Constitution funding that state DOT through its rail division could allocate to short line projects and Class 1 projects as well. Unfortunately, in the intervening 17 years, it has never, 16 years, it has never been funded by the state legislature. Now, we've looked at this, Texas Rail Advocates, very carefully. We have found that there are fairly large pools of money, like $1 billion, that have already been appropriated by the legislature, but never have been used. So one thing we would like to encourage our state legislators to do is to reallocate funds that have already been appropriated to the RRIF, which has been constitutionally authorized. In addition, of course, the state legislature, in those years when they have a budget surplus, could conceivably make a direct appropriation to the RRIF and give the rail division at TxDOT some funds to work with. And specifically, this ties back to the BIL that the council was speaking about a minute ago. In most of the programs that were authorized in the new infrastructure bill require a state or local match. And the RRIF would be available for that purpose. And it can be used for Class 1 as well as shortline and regional projects, but probably most of the activity is going to be with the short lines. And so I would encourage you to pay attention to what Peter said. Take that card that is in your folder and fill it out and send it to your state and local representatives, because they are the people who actually are going to be making the decisions. The next session of the legislature starts in January of 2023. Obviously, there are going to be some changes, but we are hopeful that maybe in 2023 we will finally get to the finish line and see funding for the RRIF. Now, this brings up a different subject which you should all keep in mind. Despite the fact that you mostly identify me with the railroads, I actually have been a trucker. And I will tell you that any time I can get the government, state or federal, to pick up a large part of my capital cost, I'm going to applaud that. I indeed am going to fight very hard to make sure that it stays that way. And the railroad industry as a whole faces a real problem of modal equity. The interstate highway system and all of the connecting federal and state highways do in fact create a network which, as a trucker, I can use for a very modest annual tax, and of course I have to pay my share of the gasoline taxes. But since those haven't been raised for, what, 20-odd years, that given inflation, that's a real edge for the trucking industry. And so coming back to what short lines do and the connection with the Class 1 carriers, a fundamental disadvantage that we face is the fact that the federal and state governments are supplementing, subsidizing the trucking activity. Now, some of this is probably good because truckers do have unique flexibility to make door-to-door deliveries. Relatively few industries are large enough to justify a separate exclusive spur, and so an increasing part of the short line business is actually transload, where it comes in on a Class 1 to a location that a short line operates, where it can be loaded into trucks for local delivery. And that's a growing part of the business, and it's an important part of the business. So I would hope that you would foster that. There are a lot of other things we could talk about, but I'd be curious to hear comments and questions from the audience, which could be directed to anyone that's here. We have some real high-powered talent here, and I'd like you to take advantage of it. So, somebody raised their hand. Whoops. Well, I don't know that that went quite the way I had hoped.
The lightning round. Come on, we can do it.
But really, the relationship between the short lines and regionals, and I would also include, though they're not formally members of the Short Line Association, the many, many industrial switching operations, some of which are owned either by the Class 1s or by regionals and group operators. That relationship is absolutely critical, and understanding how it works. And of course, there's some pushing and hauling. A Class 1 railroad always will say, well, you're so efficient, you can do it for $5 a car less. And similarly, the short line always says, yes, but our prices are going up. We got to have $5 a car more. And so that's a natural part of the business. But for those of us who are interested, and this is, of course, primarily on the freight side, but that's my background, the relationship between the Class 1s and the short lines and regionals industrial switching is a critical part, and it is the growth part of the industry. And you heard in an earlier panel how we're trying to address what the shipper really cares about, which is where is my car and when is it going to reach me? And so with that, I think we are very close to our cutoff time, yes. And so unless somebody wants to stick up their hand, I guess we will declare. Here we go. Yes, sir. Oh, Michael's going to ask a question.
Yeah, Michael Sussman. Maybe Paul or any of the panelists. You know, we're all familiar with the early history of the United States railroad industry, where the industry and its leaders and communities and government ended up, you know, sideways of each other. And here we are in 2022, where environmental catastrophe is looming, congestion issues are substantial, infrastructure costs are increasing, with something as vitally valuable to any society as freight railroads. Why do you think it's still that the opportunity of supporting freight railroads as a key mode is still not really appreciated across governments, governors, Congress, executive branch? So maybe it's just some insight from being inside the industry.
So I don't know that I wholly agree with we're not appreciated. I do see a lot that railroads, transportation in general, is looked at as a utility, just like electric utility. You turn your lights on, you just anticipate that the lights are going to turn on. You go to the stores, you just assume the shelves are going to be full. That brought magnifying glasses towards the supply chain just in the last couple of years, right? So the fact that you couldn't go to the store and get exactly what you wanted when you wanted it was highlighted through the pandemic and the necessity of the supply chain. And so, one of the things that I really took out of the supply chain from a rail industry perspective is how necessary, how significant we are as an industry to the overall supply chain. Now, we're middle mile, and so some of the congestion factors and some of the issues that were happening weren't always within the middle mile. You saw a lot of newscasts of ships out in the harbor at anchor, but what we were seeing was a lot more of the destination congestion, not allowing the middle mile to be full and filled with more goods coming from the West Coast. And so, I think the appreciation has improved in the last couple of years because we have taken for granted transportation and logistics as a whole, and I think the country saw that very clearly. I think the last presentation and all the talk about the IIJA and the billions of dollars that are being put into the rail industry, whether it's passenger or freight, is a recognition that there is significance in that system, in that mode of transportation. So I'm optimistic. I understand the question and the basis for it, but I'm coming out of the pandemic really optimistic about where we're going as an industry.
Lindsay?
That's okay. I would agree with Clint and the assumption, but understanding where you're coming from to be sure. And I think that we have an opportunity, and I'll speak specifically to Texas, but I think this is true in other states as well, to really, this is an opportunity for our industry to really sort of highlight ourselves and what we mean to the economy of the state and the nation. And so we should all, as advocates for this industry, seize that opportunity and sort of share the good news and do it effectively and do it with a unified voice and be on the same page. And so don't waste the opportunity to go out and make more friends and more champions and more allies. It's an ongoing job, we're always educating, and that education job for this team will never end. And it's great job security, so we hope that it doesn't. But I really view this, I share your optimism. That's unusual for me, but Thank y'all.
And if I could just add, I think that most people do not know what a short line railroad is. They see railroads and think we're just a part of the larger railroad, and that's just not the case. And I would also add that in the state of Texas, the millions and millions of dollars that flow in from DOT, 98%, I believe, is about the number, all goes into highway. There really is nothing happening to help grow the short line side of things. And that's really important because it doesn't matter how much money we put into the rural highways, we're not going to have enough. We have to find a way to facilitate a seamless rail network that makes things move. And then you won't worry about what the difference between the railroads is.
Well, does anyone have any other comment or question? I would just close with this thought. Many of us are very strongly motivated by environmental concerns, and the relative efficiency and the dramatically reduced pollution that a railroad causes when it's moving stuff puts my other side, my trucking side, to shame. And when we're up to now $5 a gallon diesel, or even higher in some places, the railroads do really have an opportunity. So I hope you all will help us advance that, and thank you very much. This is a great panel, and you've spoken well. Thank you. I think we're adjourned for lunch.